Today, Boris Johnson's Partygate defence, the racist, homophobic, misogynist police force and sex education. What are children being taught? This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Ben Bradley, Labour MP Ellie Reeves, the Scottish National Party's John Nicholson and head teacher Catherine Birbalsingh. On the programme today, I did not intentionally or recklessly mislead the House of Commons. Boris Johnson's Partygate defence is published ahead of tomorrow's hearing.
The culture, sadly, in the Met is all pervasive, and that the institutional racism, misogyny and homophobia is largely led by what their officers have said and what our own research has shown.
We know we've let Londoners down, and I've apologised for that, and I repeat that, and we're going to change and we're going to improve.
The Metropolitan Police is broken, says a report into its culture. Can it be put back together? Rishi Sunak's Brexit agreement, hardline Conservative Brexiteers deliver their verdict.
The Stormont break is practically useless, and the framework itself has no exit.
Across the country, children are being subjected to lessons that are age inappropriate, extreme, sexualising and inaccurate.
What are children being taught about sex and relationships? And calls for school inspections to be halted after a head teacher takes her own life. Let's start with the police report, excoriating police report by Baroness Louise Casey. You heard her there in the headlines. It was into the culture in the Metropolitan Police. Let's have a look at the front pages, and it makes most of the front pages. The Daily Mail, broken and rotten. Devastating review says Met is institutionally racist, corrupt, misogynistic and homophobic. Let's have a look at The Guardian, echoes of the same headline, racist, misogynist, homophobic, the damning verdict on the Metropolitan Police. This is the headline on the front page of The Times. Rotten Met has lost public faith. And finally, in The Express, condemned public's loss of faith in police. My opening question to the panel on the report is, can the Metropolitan Police survive in its current form? Ben?
Well, incredibly damning, isn't it? I'd like to say that, you know, my experience working with police outside of London and our local forces is excellent, and I don't recognise that across the country. I think it's a very specific Met issue, and it is hard to see how you change that, certainly not in a short period of time. The Commission's not been there very long, relatively new. There's a massive culture shift that clearly needs to happen. But I wonder where Sadiq is in all of this, to be honest.
Sadiq Khan, the London Mayor.
He is the police commissioner in his role as Mayor. He's blamed the weather, he's blamed schools and school holidays, he's blamed the government, obviously. But ultimately, he is the person accountable.
He did call for this review, of course.
He has called for the review. I hope he'll act on it now.
What do you say in response to that, Ellie? First of all, on Sadiq Khan, do you think there's been a dereliction of duty on behalf of Labour's London Mayor?
Well, Sadiq did call for the review. He wanted these issues to be looked at in detail, and that's precisely what Dame Louise Casey has done. And her report does make for incredibly difficult reading. But there is also an absence of leadership from the Home Secretary on this, for example. There are no national standards on training, vetting and misconduct in the police, and that comes from the top. That comes from the Home Secretary. That's been lacking. One of the things that Dame Louise calls for is specialist rape units to be set up in every in the force. Again, something that Labour have been called for, but the Home Secretary hasn't acted on.
And so should it be broken up? I mean, is it really too big and unwieldy and it can't cope?
Well, Dame Louise in her report is quite clear that things need to be kept under review, and in 2 years' time there needs to have been a complete transformation in terms of that culture in the Met and those recommendations being acted on, and we fully support those recommendations and the findings in that report. We want to see that change happen within that time frame and certainly well within that time frame.
I mean, the words used by Louise Casey are that they are institutionally racist, homophobic, misogynist. So Mark Rowley, who heads up the Met Police, said he agreed. Systemic failures right across the board. But he didn't want to use those words because he says they're not always helpful and they're politicised.
Well, I know just talking to, as a gay man talking to LGBT police officers, they've described to me the culture of bullying. Low-level bullying, name-calling, and sometimes more serious things. And it's deeply unpleasant. I was very struck, listening to the interviews, especially on the BBC this morning, from serving police officers. Most of them, in fact, I think all of them, wanted their names withheld, and some of them wanted their voices disguised. Now, that rather suggests that they still don't trust their police bosses because they don't feel they'll get a fair hearing. Today of all days, you'd think police officers would feel able to come out and use their own names and their voices and talk freely if they were confident that the Commissioner was going to address these problems. But I get the impression from the fact they want to remain hidden that they don't have confidence in reform.
Well, on the issue of confidence and trust, Catherine, from what you've heard, would you tell children, would you be 100% comfortable telling children you can trust the police?
Yeah, well, it is hard, isn't it? I mean, I know the police that we work with in Wembley are excellent. So, yes, for them. The buck always stops with the leader. And you were just saying about breaking it up. I mean, possibly that's the way to go. When you're dealing with a smaller institution, you're able to fix things. And if this isn't fixable, then we need to move on it. And, we can all condemn it, obviously, because we will, but we need some action points and we need to be able to do something about it.
All right, let's leave it there and turn to the former Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, whose evidence he's put forward 50 pages in his defence. It's been published today. It's been handed to something called the Privileges Committee that has been looking into whether Boris Johnson misled Parliament over parties at Downing Street. Let's just show you this particular piece from the evidence that we have been looking through from Boris Johnson. I accept that the House of Commons was misled by my statements that the rules and guidance had been followed completely at Number 10. But when the statements were made, they were made in good faith and on the basis of what I honestly knew and believed at the time. I did not intentionally or recklessly mislead the House on the 1st of December 2021, the 8th of December 2021, or on any other date. I would never have dreamed of doing so. As I say, that is early on in the 50 pages that have been handed in to the Privileges Committee. Let's find out a little bit more about the content with our political correspondent, Jonathan Blake. What's the biggest takeaway for you so far? I know you won't have had much time to have a look at the whole dossier.
Well, as you say, Jo, I think the main thrust of Boris Johnson's submission to the inquiry is that crucial excerpt which you just read out right at the beginning of his submission, where he does indeed accept that the House of Commons has been misled. Note the phrasing there. He doesn't talk about himself misleading the House of Commons directly, but as you say, he went on to say that that was done in good faith and on the basis of the evidence he had been given and was aware of at the time. It's worth just going over, though, I think, the opening paragraphs of Boris Johnson's submission. This is an attempt by the former Prime Minister to get in his defence early to the committee of MPs who are looking into whether he misled Parliament before he's questioned by them here at Westminster tomorrow. He opens by saying he takes full responsibility, as he's previously said, for everything that happened on his watch in Number 10. He says it's now clear that there were events that went past the point that they could have been said to have been reasonably necessary for work purposes. The statements he gave to the House of Commons, he says, at all times did not turn out to be correct, and he takes the opportunity to apologise to the House for that. He goes on, and this is a crucial point, to say that he corrected the record after the Sue Gray investigation into the Partygate events and also the Metropolitan Police investigation as well. And he still believes that this was the earliest opportunity at which I could have made the necessary correction. So that's one point to pick out, I think, because part of the MP's investigation will look at not only whether Boris Johnson misled Parliament, and they've already said in their interim report that he may well have done that on several occasions, and it would have been obvious to him at the time that the statements he was making were incorrect, but also whether he took the opportunity when invited to or when given the opportunity to correct the record and to answer again direct questions, updating MPs on what had happened. And the criticism is, the charge is from some, that he didn't take the opportunity to do that.
Why is the distinction so important between misleading the House and intentionally misleading the House?
Well, it is important because ministers, MPs often are found to have misled Parliament, said things in the House of Commons that turn out not to be true, whether they have incorrect information at the time, whether they inadvertently say something that isn't factually correct, they are given the opportunity to or may volunteer to correct the record, and that is the end of it. The issue here is whether Boris Johnson's statements fall into that category or whether indeed they fall into the other categories of of recklessly or intentionally misleading Parliament. And the committee of MPs looking into whether Boris Johnson misled Parliament have made that distinction, and they say if Parliament has found to have been misled, was it done so recklessly or intentionally? And where they come down on that decision and that judgment that they're weighing up will have a significant bearing on the punishment and the sanction that they recommend Boris Johnson to face.
Jonathan Blake, thank you very much. I will read a little bit more in just a moment from the submission by Boris Johnson. But first of all, Ben Bradley, what you've heard so far, will you abide by the decision of the Privileges Committee if they say that they have found that he has misled Parliament, intentionally misled Parliament, and they issue a sanction? Will you abide by it?
Well, assuming they can show it's a fair and open investigation into all of this, that'll be what they're aiming to do, then I would have thought that we all would. I'm not going to pretend I've read all of this. It came out about 20 minutes ago. But I do think, and it backs up what I've always said about this situation, which is that there's a big difference between saying the wrong thing and knowingly and intentionally saying the wrong thing. We all, as members of Parliament, rely on the briefings that we get, the staff and the people around us, to tell us what's going on. We can't be experts on everything. So I've always kind of given him that benefit of the doubt that he perhaps was told the wrong thing. I don't think there's any...
Even though these were rules and guidance that were issued by his government, of which he was head.
It's an incredibly complicated period of time in terms of those rules and guidance, and we all...
The rules were clear.
Ourselves,
I knew what the rules were.
But it's more a case of knowing what's going on in the building, isn't it? You can't expect him to do the room bookings in number 10.
If you're wandering round waving a glass of champagne in a crowded room when there's a lockdown, and he actually said this is probably the least socially distanced room in the whole of Britain. He knew what he was doing. We all knew when he was in the Commons. We all heard him. We all knew he was lying. He's a history of lying throughout his whole political career.
Now, he does refer to that statement that you have just said, or refer to probably the least socially distanced event or room that I've been at. But there was more, he says in the evidence. There was more to that statement than he actually said at that point. He also refers to his former Chief of Staff, Dominic Cummings, saying that it's no secret, we can show you the words, Dominic Cummings bears an animus towards me, having publicly stated on multiple occasions that he wanted to do everything that he could to remove me from power. He cannot be treated as a credible witness. Do you accept that?
Well, look, I need to read the report in full. It was only published just before we came on. But I think there's a couple of points to mention about this whole investigation. First of all, it seems to me that there's been a lot of people on the Conservative benches that have been trying to discredit the highly regarded Privileges Committee.
Which includes 4 Conservative MPs.
The majority, the Conservatives hold the majority of that committee, and it's really important that they are able to do their job without intimidation and without fear. And there's also a point that Boris Johnson made the rules. He ought to have stuck to them. And let's not forget, he was issued with a fixed penalty notice. And the other point is that Rishi Sunak needs to stand up to Johnson and end the taxpayers paying for his legal costs of defending himself. It simply isn't on. I don't think it's something the public would expect to happen. So I will look at the statement in full, but frankly, from everything I've seen so far, Boris Johnson does not come out of this well.
Has he been unfairly treated, Ben Bradley?
Well, all the things that were great about Boris and the reasons he was very electable were also his downfall in the end, weren't they? We know the kind of character that he is. And I think, there are lots of questions to be asked about, did he take this seriously enough? Did he investigate deeply enough? Things came out in the Sue Gray report that perhaps should have come out earlier and that he should maybe have taken control of. But that's not the same as him choosing intentionally to mislead public.
Well, let's have a look. I think we can show you some of the pictures that we have shown our viewers before. He was at the gatherings. He was at the parties. You can see here and make a judgment for yourself. There's the evidence that has been presented. And he tries to contest, from what I've read briefly in this report, he contests the words that the rules and the guidance being broken here should have been obvious. And he says, well, not necessarily so. How is it not obvious?
Well, the rules changed at various times, didn't they? There were evidence around meetings with people that you work with. We were allowed back in work buildings. There were small gatherings in work. Yeah. So it is...
But looking at that honestly, Ben, hand on heart, if you were looking at that and you were sitting on the Privileges Committee, what conclusion would you come to?
Well, if you just look at pictures with no explanation, you can see a gathering of people at a time.
Can I just say I wasn't able to go and see my mum in hospital. I knew what the rules were. I didn't see my mum for the last 2 months of her life because I wasn't able to go and see her because the rules said I couldn't go into the facility in case COVID was introduced to the respite home and other old people caught it. People up and down the country abided by the rules. They were horrible rules. They were cruel rules. They meant that people died on their own. People died of loneliness, stopped eating and drinking because they were so lonely. Boris Johnson mocked us all as a society, and he's going to get his comeuppance, and not before time.
I'm not the Boris Defence Committee, right? The investigation will look into this and will decide. But I do think, with the incredible complexity over a long period of time, as the rules changed over a long period of time, nobody was an expert in those rules.
I think people knew what the rules were, though. Come on, people weren't seeing loved ones that were dying.
But we were allowed
grandparents didn't see grandchildren. Boris Johnson set the rules. I think to say that he didn't know what they were just doesn't wash. And it's actually insulting to people who did stick to the rules, often at huge personal cost.
Catherine, looking at this from the outside, to some extent, obviously you were there through the pandemic with the rules and guidance in place. What do you make of this and this committee looking at whether Boris Johnson effectively lied to them?
Well, I think it's interesting listening to all of you because the number one thing I think was maybe there was something wrong with the rules. And nobody ever talks about the rules and whether or not we should have had those rules, Maybe Boris Johnson was mistaken to make those rules. But yes, I agree with what Ellie was saying earlier. I mean, look, the evidence is pretty damning. And from my point of view as a headmistress, there seems to be this interminable spat going on between Dominic Cummings and Boris Johnson. And I feel they both just need to be thrown into detention.
Isn't the problem that we're now... This pollutes all of us. I was talking to the disinformation minister at the Select Committee earlier on about this. And there's this concept of post-truth politics that both Johnson and Trump stand for. If you just spew enough lies, the idea is that people, the general public, will stop believing any of us in public life. That's got to be bad for politics and government, and it makes it almost impossible to get out information to the public at crucial and important times because there's a real danger the public will stop believing anything they hear.
But no doubt you'll read the dossier, the submission from Boris Johnson and see exactly what's set out. And, of course, he is the former Prime Minister in front of the Privileges Committee for what will no doubt be a pretty gruelling 4 hours tomorrow. Let me just show you this tweet from journalist Christopher Hope. Breaking news, it is indeed in the last hour or so. It says ERG chairman Mark Francois MP, that's the Conservative MP who happens to chair a group of Conservatives called the European Research Group. The Stormont break, this is the part of the Windsor framework that was introduced by Rishi Sunak, hoping for support from across the House, is practically useless, he says, and the framework itself has no exit. Brexiteer Tories and now set to vote against the Windsor framework tomorrow. Will Rishi Sunak need Labour votes to get it through? Labour have said that they will support the Prime Minister over the Windsor framework, but how difficult will it be if he has to rely on Ellie Reeves and her colleagues rather than Conservatives?
Well, clearly, more support on the Conservative benches will be very welcome. I think that's probably been inevitable since the DUP raised their concerns about it.
Well, they've rejected it too, haven't they?
You know, there is absolutely no suggestion from me that it fixes all the problems. Of course it doesn't. We're still having an ongoing conversation about our relationship with Europe, aren't we?
Right.
But it is clearly a big step forward in terms of business and trade and
But why do you support it? What is it that you support in it that Mark Francois can't?
Well, I think it's quite clear that in terms of those practical elements around trade, around the rules applying to Northern Ireland as they do the rest of the UK, and just being able to do business across that border, I think it's a huge step forward from where we have been. And though not perfect, you know, in some ways, though, let the perfect be the enemy of the good in making that relationship better for Northern Irish businesses.
Right, just briefly before we move on, Ellie, this could still be your problem because power sharing is unlikely to be restored in the near future if you've got the Democratic Unionist Party rejecting this Windsor framework, replacing the Northern Ireland Protocol, and so is a section of the Conservative Party.
But the Conservatives have created this mess. You know, Boris Johnson...
Yeah, but how will you deal with it? If it's your problem in a year's time, if you win the next election, you may still have this issue.
To start with, the Northern Ireland parties should have been involved with the negotiations in a way that they weren't. You know, Jacob Rees-Mogg was being invited into Downing Street to discuss what was going on. Where were the parties from Northern Ireland involved in all of that? So work much closely with them and actually, you know, negotiate things like a veterinary agreement with the EU, which would apply to everyone, which would help resolve some of these.
Well, closer alignment with the rules and standards of the EU.
And of course, Boris Johnson said there was an oven-ready deal, if we remember, but the DUP have made a whole series of disastrous misjudgments. To support Brexit, first of all, then to believe Boris Johnson. And now we've got a generation of young people growing up in Northern Ireland who have much less time for the sectarianism of the past.
Well, they're not
and if you're a young Protestant from a unionist family, you want access to the European Union, which you're going to get through United Ireland and EU membership. I think when the history of the breakup of the UK is written, Brexit will have played a key role in that.
Well, of course, you are advocating, as an SNP MP, exactly that break-up for an independent Scotland.
I thought that might be a good link for
Yeah, well done.
you.
Thank you for that. Let's just show you this headline in BBC News, because talking of parties in difficulty, the SNP certainly is having a torrid time. SNP Chief Executive Peter Murrell resigns over membership row. Now, it has been an extremely difficult few weeks for your party. Last month, of course, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, announced she was stepping down. And then, of course, you can see that her husband, the SNP's Chief Executive, also resigned over a row over membership. And this, then, from the interim Chief Executive who stepped in the Daily Telegraph, the SNP is in a tremendous mess. That's Mike Russell, who's taken over. It's total chaos.
Yeah, it's not good, is it? It is a complete mess. There's many things one can say about Nicola Sturgeon that are good. She's been a phenomenal First Minister. But succession planning, I don't think, has been her great strength. And we now find ourselves in a bit of a mess. We've had quite a torrid election campaign. It's been really quite unpleasant. I think the SNP isn't used to that. We haven't had one for 20 years. On the membership figures, of course, the SNP still has more members than both Labour and the Conservatives combined.
Sure, but I'm not talking about the membership. It really is the mess that the party has found itself in. Would you accept that Nicola Sturgeon stepping down, you say there's been no succession planning, has basically unleashed the splits and chasms that exist in the SNP?
Well, she had to leave at some point, obviously, didn't she? But I think a fair criticism that could be made of Nicola Sturgeon was that she concentrated power in a very, very small circle of people. And I don't think that was always the healthiest way to run the party. It meant that she sometimes missed out on advice, I think, from people who could have probably helped her. And obviously we're in a position which is far from ideal.
Well, that, of course, is her leadership and problems perhaps around that. But then there's been the issue of the party's record in government. I mean, you say it's been a difficult and torrid leadership contest so far. There are 3 candidates standing and they are tearing chunks out of each other. We've got one of them, Kate Forbes, questioning Humza Yousaf's record on everything he's ever done, transport, justice and as a health minister. I mean, what does that say about the SNP's record? They themselves, you think it's been dreadful.
Well, it says that she was very unwise to give her political opponents, our political opponents, a series of sound bites, which they could then
But is she
use
right?
against her? Well, obviously, she can't have felt that strongly about it, can she, since she sat in the cabinet and voted through the various policies which have resulted in the SNP winning 8 elections in a row. On the issue of membership, though, which has so dominated the headlines, it is interesting that the other parties don't publish their membership numbers. And I don't know if Ben could tell us, for example, how many Scottish Tory members there are at the moment.
We're going to concentrate on the SNP
that's a bit
for
of a
this.
secret, isn't it?
Let's just talk about whether you are
the answer is no to that.
Whether you are supporting any of the candidates.
I am listening carefully to the arguments and we'll make a decision in due course.
What if Kate Forbes wins? Because, as you know, there was a huge backlash when she said herself that she wouldn't have voted in favour of same-sex marriage and she didn't think that children should be born out of wedlock. I mean, would you be happy to stay in the party with Kate Forbes at the helm, somebody who doesn't believe in your relationship?
Yeah, because I'm gay and in a long-term relationship. I think she was entirely wrong to say that. I'm perfectly happy for Kate Forbes to believe whatever she likes. I understand the church that she comes from. My father's family are from the Outer Hebrides, where this church is very strong. If Kate Forbes doesn't want to be in a same-sex relationship, then Kate Forbes should not go into a same-sex relationship.
Of course. And if she's the leader?
But she shouldn't tell me what relationship I can or cannot enter into.
Well, Mhairi Black, who is the deputy leader of your party at Westminster, tweeted this. A lot of people have asked me my views of the leadership contest. Truthfully, I've been incredibly hurt so far. Hurt originating with the statements Kate Forbes has made and since stood by. I, like most people in Scotland, could not care less, as you say, about someone's religion. But she goes on to say, how I and others are expected to have faith in a leader who unashamedly and publicly believes the love between my wife and I should not be legally recognised is beyond me. Can you stay in the party with Kate Forbes as leader?
Yes, I think so, because she'll if she wins, she'll be the First Minister. But, you know, it's a democracy. The thing I don't get about these religious fundamentalists is why are they all so obsessed with sex?
Well, you'll have to ask them.
You know, the Bible tells us that we can't wear mixed fabrics or eat shellfish as well. They don't worry about that.
But you say you think you'll be able to stay. What's keeping you from saying 100% I will still be in the SNP if Kate Forbes is announced leader, or I won't be?
The SNP is a family of people who are all
falling apart.
Well, families do that sometimes, don't they? What family doesn't have big fallings out? I cannot imagine a circumstance in which I would leave the SNP. It would have to change fundamentally. But the key and important fact is young people. The membership is a bit older. The key support group is young people, and they want an independent Scotland which is liberal and progressive.
Well, to be honest, that's barely featured in some of the debates. But anyway, we're going to move on. We're going to talk about sex education being taught in schools and how it's taught in schools in England, following concerns that children are being exposed to inappropriate and extreme content. Let's take a look at this.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Graphic lessons on oral sex, how to choke your partner safely, and 72 genders. This is what passes for relationships and sex education in British schools. Across the country, children are being subjected to lessons that are age inappropriate, extreme, sexualising and inaccurate, often using resources from unregulated organisations that are actively campaigning to undermine parents. This is not a victory for equality, it is a catastrophe for childhood. Will my right honourable friend honour his commitment to end inappropriate sex education by commissioning an independent inquiry into the nature and extent of this safeguarding scandal?
That was earlier this month. Miriam Cates, the Conservative MP. Do you share her concerns, Catherine?
I do. The thing is that the guidance is very vague that comes from the top, from the DFE. So it's open to interpretation. And, of course, we've got hundreds of thousands of teachers, you know, all of these schools, thousands of schools. It's very hard to know what is being taught in different classrooms. And I'm sure that in lots of classrooms, I might agree with what's being taught, although you might not. The thing is...
Choking?
Well...
Have you ever heard of a teacher who teaches kids about choking?
Yeah, so when I tweeted...
I read her report, all 51 grim pages of it last night. She can't support or stand up any of the nonsense she said in the comments.
Well, when I tweeted about it, you know, some teachers responded to me. I mean, they showed me pictures of things with sex toys and things that I was slightly embarrassed. I didn't really know what they were. I had to ask what was being shown to me. Now, the thing is, what you can at least see, John, is that you don't actually know what's being taught in various different classrooms. And the idea that every single teacher across the land is teaching what you would imagine that ought to be taught, because you can't... Just take consent, for instance. Consent, should it be taught to 10-year-olds? Should it be taught to 12-year-olds, to 15-year-olds? There's no particular guidance. When you're talking about consent, just how graphic do you get? It's not about here's the good stuff, here's the bad stuff. There are some people who believe this, some people believe that. There is so much nuance, so much complexity, and actually it's impossible to say what is being taught in every classroom across the country.
Right, these are all good things, I think. But of course, what she was talking about was very different. It was graphic. She talked about choking. She talked about, 72 different genders, a story from the Isle of Man, which is outside our jurisdiction and wasn't true in any case. I think the key to all this, you know, Joe, is what Lee Anderson, the Vice Chair of the Conservative Party, said. He said the next election will be fought and won on culture issues and trans rights. And that's what all this is about. That MP is an evangelical Christian. I read her report. She can't justify any of the things that she said just now in the House of Commons. Over 51 pages, she was unable to produce proof of the claims that she made. And we know what this is about. It's attacking trans people and trying to heat up a right-wing culture war imported from the States.
Ben?
What has the graphic sexual lessons for primary school teachers in some of the examples primary school children I've heard got to do with trans rights? Nothing to do with trans rights.
She mentions trans rights a lot in her report.
There are also other examples about gender, massive misinterpretations of the Equality Act that are rolled out in our schools. I get these emails from concerned parents. I see examples of content from people like Mermaids or Stonewall rolling out school literature that you would not want your children to read or see. Well, that's your view, John, but the guidance needs to be much clearer. When this was rolled out a few years ago, I was told that parents would have the chance to be consulted on what their children were being taught in their lessons, and that has never happened as far as I can tell. It might be that, and I imagine in the vast majority of schools people would be comfortable, but where there are examples of real sexual content or real age-inappropriate material that's gone out, even in a minority of schools, that is really bad. It's not about culture.
What about it?
It's fundamentally about our values as a country.
Suppose the parents say you can't teach your kids that it's OK to be gay. Some parents will say that. I was at school in the 1970s, which the author, this woman, this MP, quotes favourably in 1976. I wasn't taught anything about LGBT rights, or it was OK to be gay. None of that stuff. But if you give some parents the veto, Ben...
We're not giving parents the veto. There just needs to be better central guidance that draws some lines.
Well, let me bring in Ellie. What do you think? Is it about age appropriateness? I mean, if children are being shown or taught various modes of sex or sexual positions or sorts of things, you mentioned sex toys, are these the sorts of things that could be appropriate in a primary school?
Well, look, first of all, I think we need to take the heat out of some of this discussion, because PHSE plays a really, really important part of the school,
which is the overarching sort of lessons,
the school curriculum. And my concern is that we distract from that, and it is really important. Now, I asked my 8-year-old son what he learns in his lessons, and he says that they celebrate kindness, learn about difference, and make good life choices, and that's brilliant. Kids should be learning about those.
It is,
things.
but that doesn't doesn't take on the important issues of pornography, consent, different types of
relationships. Parents should be able to request what's being taught to children, and there needs to be a mechanism by which they can raise concerns about it. There is going to be this review into what's on the curriculum, and that's going to be brought forward, and we welcome that. But it is a really important part of the curriculum, so I do think we need to take the heat out of some of this debate.
And the thing is about parental choice. I mean, parents have been told, anecdotally, and there is an issue, as Catherine raises. I mean, perhaps Miriam can't be quite as emphatic because we don't exactly know what's going on, but then perhaps neither can you, in the sense that if parents can't have input because they're told they can't see lesson plans, then it's very difficult.
Miriam made a couple of very specific claims at Prime Minister's questions, which turn out to be entirely false. Now, from what I know, and I tweeted about this and asked people to respond, I got hundreds of responses.
Yes.
One of the things a lot of parents are very concerned about is their kids turning to porn, for example, and learning about abuse, lack of respect for women, not understanding the notion of consent. This is the kind of stuff that children should be taught about consent and about respect. And, of course, it should be age-appropriate always.
Catherine, do you accept that?
Absolutely. But the thing is that we don't know. And when you say we need to give parents, you know, the ability to ask and so on, yes, but can you please all of the people all of the time? My point is that you compare two families and they will have two different ideas about what children should be taught with regard to sex. There ought to be clearer guidance coming from the top, which can be then debated and agreed, because to put head teachers in a position where we need to fight with every parent on this is dangerous.
That's exactly
and
the
worrying.
point, that if you don't get clear central guidance, you put every head teacher in that position, they have to make decisions, and that's not right. There should be a minimum standard, and there's no ceiling. Currently, there should be a ceiling, but it is ultimately for parents to decide what they choose to teach their children in that space.
What do you teach in your school, Catherine?
So we would teach reproduction and consent and all the basic biology stuff. Depends on when. So, you know, we introduce these things earlier on. Well, it's really not until year 9 or year 10 that we're getting into this stuff in more detail.
And what about
STIs?
questions? What about questions from children if they ask about things like pornography that they may have seen, and whether these things are legitimate or not? Or do you deal with those things?
Yeah, the big thing that we really want to push is what John was saying. It's just about healthy relationships, respect for each other, tolerance, being kind to each other. And lovely, when Ellie said she asked her child what he's being taught, that needs to happen across the country. I think too many parents farm the education of their child out to the schools, and they're not interacting with their children to find out.
Right. I mean, do you think Miriam Cates has, to some extent, fuelled an argument that might be very limited to a few schools and a few classes? I mean, we asked our colleagues at Radio 4 to look into the claims that she made because, yes, they're pretty striking. And they said there's no evidence of lesson plans on the 72 genders that she talked about, though children are being taught about multiple gender identities as fact. Is that acceptable?
Well, I think the latter is problematic because that is very contested, and you can get into all sorts of debates about that. But I think what Miriam's raised and the work she's done is important because it is fundamentally speaks to our values and what we teach our children. It's not just about political fighting, it's about what we teach our children and what kind of culture we want to embed in our young people. Now, that goes beyond any political argument. It might only be, and I imagine it is, just a small minority of people going off in different directions, but we don't know. That's
she
the
shouldn't
answer,
be saying
and that's why
things
this
that are
investigation is
untrue,
important.
Ben.
All right,
that's
well,
the problem.
She's not here.
Say things that are untrue.
She's not here, and I'm sure you have messaged her about it. We're going to end the programme on this story. BBC News' Ruth Perry. Ofsted urged to pause inspections after teacher death. Ruth Perry, head at Caversham Primary School in Reading, took her own life while waiting for the publication of a report that downgraded her school from outstanding to inadequate. What do you make of this terribly tragic story?
It is tragic. It's just terrible. And I know that heads are under a lot of pressure when it comes to Ofsted inspections. You know, it puts a lot of pressure on them. They have a hugely difficult job to do. I am not a defender of Ofsted as an inspectorate. You know, I think Amanda Spillman's done a brilliant job, but I don't believe in inspection in that way.
What do you mean?
Well, we as a country really ought to have the discussion over whether or not an inspectorate actually makes for a better education system, and whether the distraction of Ofsted can have heads constantly chasing a good or an outstanding, which can then distract them from doing what's right for their school in the moment. It's a discussion we ought to have, which needs to be done aside from this very emotional moment around this poor woman's death.
Right, but how will parents know if schools are performing well or not?
Well, I think parents always know. I mean, yeah. If you ask in any community, ask them which are the best schools and which are the schools they worry about, they know. They definitely know. I also think that schools should open up their doors more and have parents in more. At the moment, you come to October, you might get an open morning. Some schools may not have any open mornings at all to see the school in action for parents to visit. I think more of that should be encouraged.
Do you think Ofsted inspections should be halted?
Well, look, can I start by saying that I think all of our thoughts are with Ruth Perry's family and what has happened. Both my parents were primary school head teachers, so I saw firsthand the stress that Ofsted could cause. I don't think they should be halted, but I certainly think the system needs looking at. It's really adversarial, and I think labelling things as inadequate, good, and outstanding isn't always that helpful. And actually having some sort of scorecard method where it's easier to see areas in which a school is performing well, areas in which they're not perhaps performing as well, areas in which they're excelling, actually helps parents to make more informed decisions than just inadequate, good and outstanding, which doesn't give the whole picture of a school.
Do you think Labour would reform and review and change the way Ofsted...
We've said that we would carry out a review into how Ofsted would work and look at how moving to a scorecard system might be more beneficial in terms of improving educational opportunities and working closer with parents.
Ben?
I agree that the feedback is really important for a school to improve and to understand, and for parents to understand. But that one-line rating, I'm a council leader, we have CQC and Ofsted inspections. It's huge pressure, and you can, marginally fall the wrong side of a line, and it's really difficult. So I do get that. I think, though, I would love to see, and I think they've moved slightly in this direction, Ofsted look more broadly at the culture of a school, at the things and the priorities that a school wants to deliver for their children, rather than this really prescribed central programme. To go to a school and say, what are your priorities, and judge them against that, because I think schools know best what's right for their kids.
I mean, one of the recommendations, this is from the family of Ruth Perry, yes, is to halt the inspections until a review has been carried out, but also to remove some of the competitive nature, asking estate agents to remove all references to school ratings in the area. Do you think these are the sorts of things that might help ease the pressure on schools and head teachers?
I just think we need to have a wider conversation about schools, exactly. That you get an Ofsted rating, it's not the be-all and end-all. My favourite school in Mansfield is rated requires improvement, but I think it's brilliant because of the work they do around the broader curriculum, the way they engage with children in a much wider range of things, and they bring in financial education and cooking and all sorts of brilliant, important things. Ofsted don't think they're great, but parents know, parents love it, and I think there's just a more open conversation we need to have.
But parents do set an awful lot by the inspection gradings, or not. I mean, when Ben says parents do love it, they've taken time perhaps to go and have a look at it. I mean, in Scotland, school inspections are carried out by Education Scotland, not Ofsted. But do you think inspections are the wrong way to go in terms of having successful schools?
Well, it's true, we do have a different system in Scotland, and I know from so many of my friends who are parents just how much pressure there is to get close enough to the desired school. I've got one friend who says that depending on which floor in the apartment block she lives, you either get to the school you want or you don't. But I think all of us seem to agree, don't we, that this idea of a school standing or falling on the basis of one single word is too crude and too dismissive.
But you must have gone for outstanding. You must have had that at the forefront of your mind, that you wanted to be an outstanding school.
No, and that's really important. I will never judge myself by an Ofsted rating. I don't care. I'm interested in what's right for my kids and what's right for my school and my staff and so on. And that means I need to ignore what Ofsted's saying. And because, look, there are different leaders that come along, there are different inspectors that come along, there are different ideas. Look, I look at my kids and I think, what do we need? And move forward with that. The fact is, the head teachers are under a lot of pressure to then think, how do I get, you just said it, how do I get outstanding? That shouldn't be our goal. Our goal should be, what do my kids need? And that's how the distraction happens.
Right, but if a school is judged as being inadequate or in special measures, that is very hard for the school, isn't it?
And then when the head teacher tries to turn that around, they're working, it's almost impossible when they have that kind of label. And it's difficult. I do understand the need, you say, but parents need this. But you know what? Partly parents need to rely on an Ofsted inspection because they're not able to get into the schools to see them to judge for themselves.
Are parents engaged enough in what goes on in schools?
No, and that is exactly what we need, more parental engagement.
Is that what you see too?
It's the single biggest challenge every school tells me. How do I get my parents involved in the schools? Really difficult.
That's all we have time for today. Thank you to all of my guests for joining me. I'll be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at the earlier time, of course. Set your alarm clocks, 11:15, here on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. And, of course, we'll have PMQs. Bye-bye.
Well, I'm going to be streaming like all fucking day tomorrow then, aren't I? Jesus fucking wept. I've got to stream Boris Johnson getting grilled for 4 hours.